Force yourself to be disciplined. Discipline is forced before it is natural. Discipline is not something you wake up with, and it is not something that appears when motivation is high or life feels easy. Discipline is something you impose on yourself deliberately, consistently, and repeatedly until it becomes part of how you operate. Most people misunderstand discipline because they treat it as an emotion or a personality trait, believing that disciplined people are simply wired differently, when in reality discipline is a trained behavior enforced long before it feels natural or comfortable. If discipline depended on feeling ready, confident, or inspired, almost no one would ever become disciplined, because feelings are unstable and unreliable. This audiobook is built on a simple but uncomfortable truth. Discipline must be forced before it can ever feel normal. You do not wait until discipline feels easy. You apply pressure to your behavior until discipline becomes automatic. Motivation fades, emotions fluctuate, energy drops, and circumstances change, but discipline remains when it is rooted in structure, standards, and identity rather than mood. The people who make progress are not those who feel like doing the work. They are the ones who do the work even when resistance is present. Most people fail to build discipline because they rely on willpower alone, and willpower is a limited resource that weakens under stress, fatigue, and distraction. Discipline cannot be sustained through willpower without systems, because systems carry behavior when internal strength is low. This audiobook will teach you how to stop relying on motivation, stop negotiating with yourself, and start enforcing behavior through rules, structure, and non-negotiable standards. Discipline is not about intensity, it is about consistency under pressure. You will learn why lack of discipline is not a moral failure but a design problem, why choice weakens execution, why forced action precedes self-control, and why environment matters more than intention. Discipline is not built by trying harder, it is built by removing escape routes, limiting negotiation, and applying pressure until execution becomes predictable. When behavior is predictable, results stop being accidental. This audiobook is not designed to make you feel inspired. It is designed to make you act. Inspiration without discipline fades, but discipline without inspiration still produces results. The goal is not to feel disciplined. The goal is to behave in a disciplined way long enough for identity to change. Once identity shifts, discipline requires less effort because you are no longer fighting who you believe you are. Each chapter that follows will break down discipline into practical components you can enforce immediately, including forced daily action, removal of choice, creation of non-negotiable standards, control of environment, identity alignment, and accountability through pressure. These are not theories, they are tools. When applied consistently, they remove reliance on emotion and replace it with execution. If you want content that strengthens your discipline, sharpens your mindset, and helps you take control of your behavior regardless of how you feel, make sure to subscribe to Audiobook Soundz, Chasing Greatness, so you never miss audiobooks designed to push you beyond comfort and into control. Discipline is not built by waiting for the right moment. It is built by forcing the right behavior until resistance weakens and execution becomes normal. This audiobook will show you how to do exactly that. Force discipline now, and the freedom you want will follow later. Chapter 1. Why you lack discipline and why willpower is not the problem. Most people believe they lack discipline because they are weak, lazy, unmotivated, or flawed in some personal way, but this belief is both inaccurate and destructive because it focuses attention on character instead of structure. Discipline does not fail because of who you are. Discipline fails because of how your behavior is designed. When your daily actions depend on willpower, emotion, or mood, inconsistency becomes inevitable, not because you are incapable, but because the system you are using is unstable. Willpower is not a reliable foundation for discipline because it is finite, reactive, and easily depleted by stress, fatigue, decision-making, and emotional pressure. Each time you rely on willpower to force yourself to act, you draw from a limited reserve that weakens as the day progresses. By the time life becomes demanding, your ability to resist comfort collapses, and discipline disappears. This is not a personal weakness, it is a biological limitation. Any system that depends heavily on willpower will fail under pressure. The reason discipline feels difficult is not because effort itself is unbearable, but because effort is constantly competing with comfort in an environment that rewards ease, distraction, and avoidance. When comfort is always available and consequences are delayed, the brain learns that discipline is optional. Over time, this creates a habit of avoidance that feels like a lack of discipline, even though it is simply a learned response to low-pressure conditions. The brain chooses what is easiest when no structure forces otherwise. Another major reason people struggle with discipline is emotional dependence. Many people unknowingly train themselves to act only when they feel motivated, confident, energized, or emotionally prepared. This creates a dangerous pattern where action becomes conditional, and conditional action is unreliable. Emotions fluctuate constantly, which means behavior fluctuates with them. When discipline depends on emotion, it disappears the moment discomfort appears. Discipline cannot survive emotional control. Lack of discipline is also reinforced by excessive choice. When you decide every day whether to wake up early, whether to focus, whether to work, or whether to stay committed, you create constant negotiation. Negotiation drains mental energy and weakens resolve. The more often you debate action, the more likely you are to delay it. Discipline collapses not because you chose the wrong option, but because you allowed the option to choose at all. Many people also lack discipline because their standards are unclear or negotiable. When expectations are vague, effort becomes inconsistent. If you do not define what must be done daily regardless of circumstance, your behavior adapts to comfort instead of commitment. Clear standards eliminate ambiguity. Ambiguity invites excuses. Discipline requires certainty, not flexibility driven by mood. Another overlooked factor is the absence of immediate consequence. Skipping discipline rarely hurts right away, while exerting effort feels uncomfortable immediately. The brain prioritizes short-term comfort over long-term benefit, which means discipline must be enforced through systems that create present-moment accountability. When there is no cost to skipping, skipping becomes normal. Discipline strengthens when avoidance carries consequence. Environment also plays a critical role. If your surroundings are filled with distractions, convenience, and constant stimulation, discipline must fight continuously to survive. This fight is exhausting and unsustainable. People who appear disciplined are often simply operating in environments that remove temptation and reduce friction. When environment supports execution, discipline feels lighter, not because the person is stronger, but because resistance is lower. Many people mistakenly believe that disciplined individuals feel disciplined, when in reality disciplined individuals act without waiting to feel ready. Discipline is not an internal feeling. It is external behavior repeated consistently. The feeling often comes later, after identity has shifted. Waiting to feel disciplined before acting guarantees delay. Acting consistently, even when discipline feels absent, is how discipline is built. It is important to understand that lacking discipline does not mean you lack potential. It means you have been operating without enforced systems. Once systems are introduced, behavior changes quickly. Structure replaces willpower. Rules replace emotion. Standards replace negotiation. Discipline becomes mechanical rather than emotional, and mechanical systems are far more reliable. This chapter exists to remove shame and redirect responsibility. You are not broken, and you do not need more motivation. You need better design. You need fewer choices, clearer standards, stronger structure, and systems that force execution when emotions resist. Discipline is not something you discover within yourself. It is something you construct around yourself. When you stop blaming willpower and start redesigning behavior, discipline becomes achievable. When discipline becomes achievable, consistency follows. And when consistency follows, progress becomes predictable rather than accidental. This is the foundation everything else builds on. Discipline does not begin with trying harder. It begins with understanding why effort keeps failing and removing the conditions that allow failure to repeat. Once those conditions are removed, discipline no longer feels mysterious. It becomes something you enforce, train, and eventually embody. Chapter 2. Motivation is temporary, discipline is permanent. Motivation is often mistaken for the driving force behind success, but in reality it is one of the weakest foundations upon which to build disciplined behavior, because motivation is emotional, inconsistent, and dependent on conditions that are rarely stable for long. Motivation rises when things feel exciting, new, or rewarding, and it disappears when effort becomes repetitive, uncomfortable, or slow to produce visible results. This makes motivation unreliable by nature, not because it is useless, but because it was never designed to carry long-term responsibility. The problem with relying on motivation is not that it feels good, but that it creates a false expectation that action should always feel supported by enthusiasm or desire. When people expect motivation to be present before they act, they unintentionally train themselves to delay execution whenever motivation is absent. Over time, this creates a pattern where progress only happens during emotional highs, and stagnation dominates everything else. Discipline cannot survive in a system where action is conditional on feeling ready. Motivation responds to emotion, not obligation. It is influenced by sleep, stress, mood, confidence, environment, and external validation. Discipline, on the other hand, responds to standards. Standards do not change based on how you feel. Standards exist to remove emotional influence from behavior. This is why discipline outlasts motivation, because discipline does not ask for permission from emotion. It enforces behavior regardless of internal state. Many people confuse motivation with commitment. Motivation says, "I feel like doing this," while commitment says, "This must be done." Commitment operates independently of emotion, and discipline is the behavior that commitment produces. When commitment is weak, motivation must carry the load, and when motivation disappears, effort collapses. Strong discipline replaces emotional dependence with obligation-driven execution. Another danger of motivation is that it creates inconsistency through intensity. Motivation often produces bursts of extreme effort followed by periods of exhaustion or avoidance. People start strong, push hard, and then burn out because motivation encourages overexertion without sustainability. Discipline encourages moderation, consistency, and repeatability. It focuses on showing up daily rather than performing exceptionally once. Progress compounds through repetition, not intensity. Motivation also creates selective discipline. People feel motivated to work on tasks they enjoy or that feel rewarding, but avoid tasks that feel boring, uncomfortable, or difficult. This selective effort creates imbalance, because the most important actions are often the least emotionally appealing. Discipline ensures that essential work gets done even when it lacks excitement. Without discipline, difficult but necessary tasks are postponed indefinitely. Discipline is permanent because it is built into structure rather than emotion. When you operate from discipline, behavior becomes predictable. You know what you will do tomorrow, not because you feel like it, but because it is required. This predictability reduces mental conflict, because decisions are made in advance. When action is predefined, resistance weakens, and consistency strengthens. Another reason discipline outperforms motivation is that discipline builds trust with yourself. Each time you act without relying on motivation, you reinforce the belief that you follow through regardless of circumstance. This self-trust reduces hesitation and doubt. Motivation does not build self-trust because it disappears when conditions change. Discipline builds identity through repeated proof. Motivation is external-facing. It often depends on inspiration, encouragement, praise, or visible progress. Discipline is internal-facing. It is guided by values, standards, and long-term vision rather than immediate reward. This internal orientation makes discipline resilient. When praise disappears or results are delayed, discipline continues to operate because it is not fueled by validation. It is also important to understand that motivation is not useless. It is simply unreliable. Motivation works best as a supplement, not a foundation. When discipline is already in place, motivation can increase output temporarily, but discipline ensures that output exists even when motivation is absent. The mistake is reversing this relationship and expecting motivation to create discipline. Discipline also simplifies life. When behavior is disciplined, you spend less time debating, procrastinating, or restarting. You reduce emotional turbulence because your actions are no longer at the mercy of your feelings. This creates mental clarity and reduces stress. Discipline does not make life harder, it makes life more stable. Many people fear discipline because they associate it with restriction or punishment, but discipline is actually a form of self-respect. It is the act of honoring commitments you make to yourself. When you repeatedly ignore those commitments, motivation becomes a coping mechanism to escape responsibility. Discipline eliminates the need for coping by enforcing action regardless of mood. Discipline becomes permanent when it is enforced long enough to become habitual. At that point, action no longer feels forced, it feels expected. The brain adapts to repetition and begins to conserve energy by automating behavior. This is why disciplined people often appear calm rather than driven. They are not pushing themselves emotionally, they are following systems that no longer require intense effort. The shift from motivation to discipline is a shift from emotion to identity. You stop asking whether you feel like doing the work and start asking whether this is who you are. When behavior aligns with identity, discipline becomes self-sustaining. Emotion loses authority because identity provides direction. This chapter establishes a critical distinction. Motivation may start you, but discipline sustains you. Motivation may inspire you, but discipline carries you through repetition, difficulty, and delay. Motivation fades with time, but discipline strengthens with use. If you want results that last, you cannot depend on something that disappears. Discipline is permanent because it is built on obligation, structure, and identity rather than emotion. Once discipline is established, motivation becomes optional, and progress becomes predictable. This is why disciplined people continue moving forward long after motivated people stop. They do not rely on how they feel, they rely on what they have decided. And that decision, enforced daily, is what turns effort into outcome. Chapter 3. Discipline is built through forced daily action. Discipline is not something that appears before action. Discipline is the result of action repeated consistently under resistance, because the human mind does not change through intention but through behavior. Many people wait to feel disciplined before they act, believing that confidence, readiness, or motivation must come first, but this belief keeps them trapped in inaction, because discipline is not a feeling that precedes effort, it is a condition created by effort. Action comes first, and discipline follows afterward as a byproduct of repetition. Forced daily action is necessary because the mind naturally resists discomfort, effort, and responsibility, especially when comfort is easily available. When you attempt to act only when it feels natural or easy, You train avoidance rather than discipline. Forced action interrupts this pattern by demanding execution regardless of emotional resistance. This demand is not cruelty, it is training. Just as physical strength increases when muscles are stressed repeatedly, discipline increases when behavior is enforced repeatedly despite internal resistance. The purpose of forced action is not to achieve perfect performance, it is to establish compliance. Discipline begins when the brain learns that action is required regardless of mood, fatigue, or preference. Once this expectation is established, resistance weakens, because the mind adapts to what is consistently demanded. What feels forced in the beginning eventually becomes normal, not because it becomes enjoyable, but because it becomes familiar. Many people misunderstand forced action and believe it requires extreme effort or intensity every day, which leads to burnout and eventual collapse. True forced action focuses on minimum non-negotiable execution rather than maximum performance. The goal is not to push yourself to exhaustion. The goal is to show up consistently without negotiation. Consistency is built by repetition, not by intensity. Small actions forced daily build far more discipline than occasional bursts of extreme effort. Forced daily action also eliminates dependence on emotion. When action is enforced by rule rather than feeling, emotion loses its authority over behavior. You may still feel resistance, boredom, doubt, or fatigue, but those feelings no longer determine whether you act. Over time, this separation trains emotional resilience because the mind learns that discomfort does not equal danger and does not require avoidance. Discipline grows as emotional tolerance increases. Another critical function of forced action is identity formation. Every time you act when you do not feel like it, you provide evidence that you are someone who follows through. Identity is built from proof, not affirmation. Repeated forced action rewires self-perception, shifting your identity from someone who tries when motivated to someone who executes regardless of condition. Once identity begins to change, discipline becomes easier to maintain because behavior aligns with who you believe you are. Forced action also reduces internal negotiation, which is one of the biggest enemies of discipline. Inconsistent people negotiate constantly, debating whether to start, whether to continue, or whether to stop. This negotiation drains energy and usually ends in avoidance. Forced action removes negotiation by making execution mandatory. When there is no debate, the mind complies. Discipline strengthens when negotiation is eliminated. Daily enforcement is essential because discipline is built through frequency, not occasional effort. When forced action is applied sporadically, resistance remains strong and habits never stabilize. Daily execution trains the brain to expect effort as part of normal life. Skipping days weakens this expectation and reintroduces resistance. Discipline becomes reliable when execution is predictable. Forced daily action must also be time-bound and specific to be effective. Vague commitments invite avoidance. Clear actions enforced at specific times reduce friction and increase compliance. When the brain knows exactly when action happens and what is required, resistance decreases because uncertainty is removed. Structure supports forced action by making execution simpler. It is important to understand that forced action is temporary in intensity but permanent in effect. In the early stages, effort feels heavy because resistance is strong. Over time, as behavior becomes habitual, the need to consciously force action diminishes. Discipline transitions from effortful enforcement to automatic execution. The force is not permanent, but the habit it creates is. Many people quit forcing action too early, interpreting discomfort as a sign that something is wrong, when in reality discomfort is evidence that change is occurring. Discipline feels uncomfortable precisely because it is unfamiliar. If you retreat at the first sign of resistance, discipline never has a chance to form. Endurance during early resistance is what separates lasting discipline from repeated failure. Forced action also teaches self-leadership. Instead of negotiating with yourself or seeking external motivation, you learn to give yourself instructions and follow them. This internal authority is essential for long-term discipline because external pressure is not always available. When you learn to enforce behavior internally, discipline becomes self-sustaining. The most important rule of forced daily action is consistency over perfection. Missing once does not destroy discipline, but abandoning the pattern does. When disruption occurs, discipline is preserved by returning to execution immediately rather than indulging guilt or self-criticism. Discipline is maintained by continuity, not flawless performance. This chapter establishes a core truth. Discipline is built by acting first and feeling later. You do not wait for discipline to arrive. You train it through forced daily action. Every day you enforce execution despite resistance, you weaken avoidance and strengthen reliability. Over time, what once required force becomes standard behavior. Discipline is not discovered, it is installed through repetition. Forced daily action is the installation process. When applied consistently, it rewires behavior, reshapes identity, and creates a level of control that motivation alone can never provide. Chapter 4. Remove choice, enforce standards. Discipline weakens the moment behavior becomes optional, because choice creates negotiation, and negotiation creates delay, avoidance, and eventual failure. Most people do not fail because they choose the wrong action. They fail because they repeatedly give themselves the option to choose whether to act at all. Every time you wake up and decide whether to be disciplined, you place discipline at the mercy of mood, energy, and comfort. When discipline depends on daily choice, inconsistency becomes inevitable. Choice feels empowering, but when applied to daily execution, it becomes destructive, because the human mind is wired to choose ease whenever difficulty is optional. If you allow yourself to decide whether to train, focus, work, or execute, the brain will eventually choose comfort, especially under stress or fatigue. This is not a moral flaw, it is predictable behavior. Discipline survives only when choice is removed at the behavioral level. Removing choice means deciding once in advance and enforcing that decision repeatedly without renegotiation. It means defining when action happens, what action happens, and what minimum standard must be met, and then treating those decisions as fixed rules rather than flexible preferences. When behavior is ruled by standards instead of emotion, discipline stabilizes because the decision has already been made. You are no longer asking whether to act, you are executing what has been defined. Standards are the mechanism that replaces choice. A standard is not a goal and not a desire, it is a rule that governs behavior regardless of mood. Goals describe outcomes, but standards dictate daily actions. Without standards, goals remain aspirational. With standards, goals become operational. Discipline exists where standards are clear, enforced, and non-negotiable. Many people set intentions but avoid setting standards because standards create accountability. Intentions are safe because they allow flexibility, excuses, and reinterpretation. Standards remove ambiguity. They clearly define what acceptable behavior looks like, which means failure becomes visible. This visibility is uncomfortable, but it is essential, because discipline cannot grow in ambiguity. Discipline requires clarity. Enforcing standards eliminates internal debate. When a standard exists, there is nothing to negotiate. Negotiation only happens when rules are unclear or optional. When standards are enforced consistently, the brain stops arguing and starts complying. Compliance is not weakness, it is training. The brain adapts quickly to what is consistently required, and once adaptation occurs, resistance weakens. Another reason standards are powerful is that they reduce decision fatigue. Constant decision-making drains mental energy and weakens discipline over time. When standards are in place, decisions are removed from daily life. You do not decide whether to act, you decide only how to execute the standard. This preserves mental energy and increases reliability. Standards must be specific to be effective. Vague standards invite interpretation, and interpretation invites excuses. A standard such as "be productive" is meaningless because it has no enforcement mechanism. A standard such as "work for one focused hour at a fixed time every day" is enforceable because it is clear. Discipline improves when standards are measurable and observable. It is also critical that standards focus on minimum execution rather than maximum performance. Discipline collapses when standards are unrealistic, because unrealistic rules are eventually abandoned. Effective standards are achievable even on low-energy days. The purpose of standards is not to push you to your limits daily, but to ensure consistency under all conditions. Reliability builds discipline far more effectively than intensity. Standards also protect discipline during emotional instability. When stress increases or motivation disappears, standards prevent collapse by maintaining structure. You may not perform at your best, but you still perform. This continuity is what prevents regression. Discipline is preserved not by excellence, but by presence. Enforcement is what gives standards power. A standard that is repeatedly broken without consequence stops being a standard and becomes a suggestion. Discipline strengthens when violations are addressed immediately and consistently. This does not require punishment, but it does require acknowledgement and correction. Ignoring violations trains the brain that discipline is optional. Standards also shape identity. When you consistently meet your standards, self-trust increases. You begin to see yourself as someone who follows through, not because you feel confident, but because your behavior confirms it. Identity built through standards is stable, because it is grounded in action rather than emotion. Removing choice does not mean removing freedom. True freedom is not the ability to do whatever you feel like doing. True freedom is the ability to act in alignment with your long-term goals regardless of momentary impulses. Standards create this freedom by protecting you from emotional decision-making. They allow you to act intentionally rather than reactively. Many people resist standards because they fear rigidity, but lack of standards creates chaos. Discipline requires structure to survive. Structure is not the enemy of growth. It is the foundation of it. When structure is absent, effort becomes inconsistent, and inconsistency erodes confidence and momentum. This chapter reinforces a core principle of discipline. If you want to eliminate failure, you must eliminate choice at the behavioral level. Discipline thrives in environments where action is expected, not debated. When standards replace emotion and enforcement replaces negotiation, discipline becomes reliable rather than fragile. Remove choice, enforce standards, and discipline stops being something you hope to have and becomes something you live by. Once behavior is governed by rules rather than feelings, progress becomes predictable and self-control becomes a natural consequence rather than a constant struggle. Chapter 5. Create non-negotiable discipline rules. Discipline becomes reliable only when it is governed by rules that are non-negotiable, because rules remove emotion from behavior and replace uncertainty with obligation. Most people struggle with discipline because their expectations are flexible, adjustable, and dependent on how they feel in the moment, which means effort rises and falls with mood rather than remaining stable. When rules are negotiable, discipline collapses under pressure, but when rules are non-negotiable, behavior remains consistent regardless of internal resistance. A non-negotiable rule is a decision you make once and enforce repeatedly without revisiting it emotionally. It does not ask how you feel, how tired you are, or how motivated you seem, it simply defines what must be done. This removes internal debate, which is one of the biggest sources of inconsistency. When the brain knows that negotiation is not an option, it stops expending energy on resistance and redirects that energy toward execution. Discipline strengthens when resistance is denied influence. Many people confuse rules with goals, but they are fundamentally different. Goals describe outcomes you want to achieve, while rules define behaviors you must perform daily regardless of outcome. Goals live in the future, but rules operate in the present. Discipline exists in the present moment, which is why rules are more powerful than goals. You cannot enforce a goal daily, but you can enforce a rule daily, and consistent rule enforcement eventually produces the outcome the goal describes. Non-negotiable rules must be simple to be effective. Complexity invites loopholes, and loopholes invite excuses. A rule should be clear, specific, and measurable, leaving no room for interpretation. When rules are vague, the mind exploits ambiguity to escape effort. When rules are precise, compliance becomes straightforward. Discipline improves when expectations are unmistakable. Rules should also focus on minimum execution rather than ideal performance. Discipline is built through reliability, not intensity. A rule that demands perfection will eventually be broken, while a rule that demands consistency will endure. Non-negotiable does not mean extreme, it means unavoidable. The rule must be achievable even on low-energy days, because discipline must survive difficult conditions to be meaningful. Another critical function of non-negotiable rules is that they protect discipline during emotional volatility. Stress, boredom, frustration, and doubt all attempt to interfere with execution by offering justification to stop. Rules neutralize this interference by making behavior independent of emotion. You may still experience resistance, but resistance no longer dictates action. Rules become the authority, and discipline becomes the result of obedience to that authority. Rules also reduce decision fatigue. When behavior is ruled by standards rather than choices, mental energy is preserved. You no longer decide whether to act, you decide only how to execute the rule. This simplification increases consistency because it removes repeated cognitive strain. Discipline becomes lighter not because effort disappears, but because decision-making does. Enforcement is what gives rules power. A rule that is repeatedly broken without consequence stops functioning as a rule and becomes a suggestion. Discipline strengthens when violations are acknowledged and corrected immediately. Enforcement does not require harsh punishment, but it does require accountability. Ignoring broken rules trains the brain to disregard future rules. Consistent enforcement trains the brain to comply automatically. Rules also shape identity over time. Each time you follow a non-negotiable rule, you reinforce the belief that you are someone who honors commitments regardless of comfort. Identity is built through repeated behavior, not self-description. When rules are enforced daily, identity stabilizes around execution, and discipline becomes part of who you are rather than something you attempt intermittently. It is important to limit the number of rules you create initially. Too many rules overwhelm attention and weaken enforcement. Effective discipline systems begin with a small number of high-impact rules that govern core behaviors. Once these rules are stable, additional rules can be added gradually. Discipline grows through layering, not overload. Non-negotiable rules should also be time-bound and anchored to routine. When rules are attached to specific times or conditions, execution becomes easier because the brain anticipates action. Anticipation reduces resistance. When action is predictable, compliance improves. Discipline thrives in predictability. Rules must also align with long-term priorities. Enforcing rules that do not support meaningful goals creates frustration rather than progress. Discipline is not about controlling everything. It is about controlling what matters most. Well-designed rules protect your priorities from distraction, impulse, and emotional interference. Another important aspect of non-negotiable rules is that they remove self-judgment. Instead of evaluating yourself emotionally, you evaluate behavior objectively. Either the rule was followed or it was not. This clarity reduces anxiety and increases accountability. Discipline improves when evaluation is factual rather than emotional. Non-negotiable rules are not restrictive, they are liberating. They free you from constant internal conflict, second-guessing, and self-negotiation. When rules are in place, behavior becomes simpler. Simplicity reduces resistance, and reduced resistance supports consistency. This chapter reinforces a critical truth. Discipline does not survive on intention, desire, or emotion. It survives on rules that are enforced consistently. When rules are non-negotiable, discipline becomes predictable. When discipline is predictable, progress becomes inevitable. Create rules you can enforce daily, enforce them regardless of mood, and protect them from negotiation. Over time, these rules will stop feeling forced and start feeling natural, because the brain adapts to what is consistently required. Discipline becomes who you are when rules govern what you do. Chapter 6. Design your environment for discipline. Discipline does not operate in isolation. It is heavily influenced by the environment you place yourself in, because behavior is shaped more by surroundings than by intention. Many people attempt to force discipline through willpower while living in environments that constantly encourage distraction, comfort, and avoidance, and this contradiction guarantees failure over time. If your environment rewards ease and punishes effort, discipline will always feel exhausting, but when your environment supports execution, discipline becomes significantly easier to maintain. The human brain responds automatically to cues in its surroundings. What you see, hear, and have access to influences your behavior long before conscious decision-making begins. When distractions are visible, discipline weakens. When comfort is easily accessible, effort is delayed. When stimulation is constant, focus deteriorates. This is not a flaw in character. It is how the brain adapts to repeated exposure. If you do not intentionally design your environment, it will default to convenience, and convenience undermines discipline. Designing your environment for discipline means reducing friction for the behaviors you want to repeat and increasing friction for the behaviors you want to eliminate. When the right action is easy to start and the wrong action is difficult to access, consistency improves automatically. Discipline grows not because you are forcing yourself harder, but because resistance has been reduced. Intelligent design makes discipline sustainable. Your physical environment plays a critical role in this process. A cluttered, chaotic space encourages mental distraction, while an organized, intentional space encourages focus and clarity. When your workspace is prepared for execution, your brain associates that space with effort rather than avoidance. You do not need perfection, but you do need alignment. Your surroundings should signal discipline, not comfort or escape. Digital environments are equally powerful. Phones, social media, notifications, and constant digital stimulation fragment attention and weaken discipline without obvious warning. Every interruption retrains the brain to seek novelty rather than sustained effort. Designing a disciplined digital environment requires limiting notifications, controlling access to distracting platforms during execution periods, and intentionally separating work time from consumption time. Discipline cannot survive constant interruption. Your social environment also shapes your behavior. The people you spend time with influence what feels normal, acceptable, and expected. If inconsistency, excuses, and avoidance are normalized in your circle, discipline becomes harder to maintain. If effort, accountability, and execution are normalized, Discipline feels natural. You do not need everyone around you to be disciplined, but you must protect yourself from environments that actively undermine your standards. Time is another form of environment that must be designed intentionally. When your day lacks structure, behavior becomes reactive. When time is undefined, discipline is postponed. Fixed routines create predictability, and predictability reduces resistance. When your brain knows what happens at specific times, it stops negotiating and starts complying. Discipline thrives in predictable time structures. Environmental cues also influence habit formation. Certain locations, times, and conditions trigger specific behaviors automatically. If your bed is associated with scrolling, restlessness increases. If your desk is associated with focus, execution improves. Designing your environment for discipline means intentionally pairing environments with specific behaviors so that action becomes automatic rather than effortful. Many people try to change behavior without changing environment, which is why progress feels temporary. Behavior rarely survives environmental contradiction. If your environment constantly invites distraction, discipline must fight continuously to exist. Over time, this fight leads to exhaustion. When environment supports discipline, effort feels lighter because resistance is reduced before it appears. Designing your environment also means preparing for weakness. Discipline is most vulnerable when energy is low, stress is high, or boredom appears. A well-designed environment anticipates these moments by making the discipline choice the default option even when mental strength is limited. Preparation reduces reliance on willpower and increases reliability of execution. It is important to understand that environment does not replace discipline. It supports it. Discipline initiates change, but environment sustains it. Once disciplined behavior becomes consistent, environment reinforces identity, and identity reinforces behavior. This creates a self-reinforcing loop where discipline becomes easier over time rather than harder. Discipline fails not because people lack strength, but because they fight unnecessary battles every day. A poorly designed environment creates constant temptation, distraction, and resistance. A well-designed environment removes many of these obstacles before they appear. Discipline becomes about execution rather than survival. This chapter reinforces a critical truth. If your environment does not support discipline, discipline will eventually lose. You cannot out-willpower your surroundings indefinitely. Control your environment, and you control the conditions under which your behavior operates. When conditions favor execution, discipline becomes reliable. Design your environment intentionally, remove distractions deliberately, structure your time predictably, and surround yourself with cues that signal effort rather than escape. When your environment works with you instead of against you, discipline stops being a constant struggle and becomes a natural outcome of intelligent design. Chapter 7. Discipline is identity, not emotion. Discipline is sustained not by how you feel in the moment, but by who you believe you are, because emotions are unstable, reactive, and constantly changing, while identity is stable, directive, and self-reinforcing. Many people attempt to stay disciplined by managing their emotions, waiting to feel motivated, confident, energized, or inspired, but this approach guarantees inconsistency because emotions fluctuate based on sleep, stress, environment, and circumstance. When discipline depends on emotion, it collapses the moment discomfort appears, but when discipline is rooted in identity, behavior remains consistent regardless of how you feel. Identity is the internal framework that determines what you do automatically without negotiation. When you identify as someone who shows up, executes, and follows through, your behavior aligns with that identity even when resistance is present. You do not ask whether you feel like acting. You act because that is who you are. This is why identity-based discipline is far more reliable than emotion-based discipline. Emotion seeks comfort, but identity demands alignment. Most people struggle with discipline because they operate from an identity of flexibility rather than an identity of execution. They see themselves as someone who tries when conditions are favorable, instead of someone who acts regardless of condition. Every time action is skipped due to mood, fatigue, or doubt, this identity is reinforced. Over time, inconsistency stops feeling like a problem and starts feeling normal because behavior is aligning with self-image. Identity always seeks confirmation through action. Discipline becomes stable when you stop asking how to feel disciplined and start asking who you must be disciplined as. The question shifts from emotion to alignment. When your identity says, "I am someone who does what must be done daily," skipping becomes psychologically uncomfortable because it conflicts with who you believe yourself to be. This internal tension is powerful because the mind prefers alignment over contradiction. Identity-driven discomfort pushes you back into action automatically. Emotions are short-term signals, not long-term guides. They are influenced by temporary conditions and are designed to respond to immediate stimuli, not long-term goals. Identity, however, is built around standards and values that extend beyond the present moment. When behavior is guided by identity, emotions lose authority. You may still feel resistance, boredom, stress, or fatigue, but those feelings no longer dictate action. Discipline becomes independent of mood. Identity is not created through affirmation or positive thinking. It is created through repeated behavior. The brain updates identity based on evidence. Each time you act when you do not feel like it, you provide evidence that you are disciplined. Each time you avoid action, you provide evidence that you are not. Over time, this evidence accumulates and solidifies identity. This is why forced action is essential in the early stages of discipline, because it supplies the proof required for identity change. Once identity begins to shift, discipline requires less conscious effort. You stop fighting yourself because your actions are no longer in conflict with your self-image. Execution feels simpler, not because effort disappears, but because resistance weakens. Acting in alignment with identity feels easier than acting against it. This is the point where discipline transitions from struggle to standard behavior. Identity-based discipline also simplifies decision-making. When you know who you are, you know how you act. There is no need for daily debate, negotiation, or justification. Decisions are made in advance through identity. This reduction in internal conflict preserves mental energy and strengthens consistency. Discipline becomes predictable because behavior is predetermined by self-image. Another reason identity is more powerful than emotion is that identity persists under pressure. Stress, adversity, and fatigue amplify emotion and weaken motivation, but identity remains intact when it is well-formed. During difficult periods, identity acts as an anchor that stabilizes behavior. You do not act because conditions are ideal, you act because this is what someone like you does. This is how discipline survives hardship. Identity must be protected intentionally. Exposure to environments, people, and habits that normalize inconsistency weakens identity over time. This is why environment and standards are critical supports. They reinforce the identity you are building by making disciplined behavior the default response. When identity is unsupported, emotion regains control. When identity is reinforced consistently, discipline becomes resilient. Discipline anchored in identity also increases self-trust. When you repeatedly follow through, your mind learns that your decisions matter. This trust reduces hesitation and doubt, because the brain no longer questions whether you will act. Self-trust is a quiet but powerful outcome of identity-based discipline, and it makes consistency easier to sustain over time. It is important to understand that identity does not change instantly. It changes gradually as behavior becomes consistent. This is why patience is required. Early discipline feels forced because identity has not yet caught up with behavior. Over time, as evidence accumulates, identity updates, and discipline becomes less effortful. The force is temporary, but the identity it builds is lasting. Discipline fails when people try to change how they feel instead of changing how they act. Feelings follow behavior, not the other way around. When you act consistently, confidence grows, resistance weakens, and emotions begin to align with behavior. Identity shifts as a result of this alignment. Discipline becomes who you are, not something you try to maintain. This chapter reinforces a core truth. Discipline is not sustained by emotional strength, but by identity clarity. When you define yourself as someone who executes regardless of feeling, discipline becomes stable, repeatable, and resilient. You stop being someone who tries to be disciplined and become someone who simply is. When discipline is rooted in identity, inconsistency loses its power because skipping no longer feels like relief. It feels like misalignment. Execution becomes the default response, not because it is always easy, but because it is expected. This is the level at which discipline becomes permanent. Chapter 8. Staying disciplined when life gets hard. Discipline is not truly tested when life is stable, predictable, and comfortable. Discipline is tested when pressure increases, energy drops, emotions become heavy, and circumstances interfere with your plans. Many people can maintain discipline during easy seasons, but discipline collapses when life becomes demanding because their systems were built for convenience rather than adversity. If your discipline only functions when conditions are ideal, then it is not discipline. It is comfort-driven compliance. Life will introduce stress, fatigue, unexpected problems, emotional strain, and mental overload, and these conditions are unavoidable. The mistake most people make is assuming discipline should pause until life improves, when in reality discipline must be designed to survive difficulty rather than wait for relief. Progress does not stop because life becomes hard. Progress stops because discipline was never built to endure pressure. The first rule of staying disciplined during hard times is maintaining execution even when performance must be reduced. Many people quit entirely when they cannot operate at their best because they believe partial effort is failure. This all-or-nothing mindset destroys discipline. Discipline is not about optimal performance. It is about continuity. When life is difficult, the goal is not to perform exceptionally. The goal is to remain consistent at a minimum level. Maintaining the habit matters more than maintaining intensity. Hard times expose unrealistic standards. If your discipline system requires high energy, perfect focus, or ideal conditions, it will collapse under stress. Discipline survives difficulty when standards are designed to be achievable even on your worst days. A reduced action repeated consistently preserves momentum and prevents regression. Consistency at a lower level is far more powerful than perfection that cannot be sustained. Emotional pressure also increases during difficult periods, and emotions attempt to dominate behavior by offering justification to stop, delay, or disengage. Stress, frustration, exhaustion, and disappointment all push the mind toward avoidance. Staying disciplined during hard times requires accepting discomfort without trying to eliminate it. You do not wait to feel better before acting. You act while discomfort is present. This trains emotional resilience and prevents emotion from becoming the authority over behavior. Structure becomes more important, not less, when life is difficult. When mental capacity is reduced, decision-making weakens, and discipline becomes harder to access. Fixed routines, predefined execution times, and simplified rules reduce cognitive load and preserve consistency. The more chaotic life becomes, the more structured your behavior must be. Structure compensates for reduced emotional and mental strength. Another reason discipline collapses during hard times is the false belief that rest must replace structure. Rest is necessary, but rest without discipline leads to disengagement. The correct approach is adjustment, not abandonment. You may shorten sessions, reduce expectations, or simplify tasks, but you do not remove the habit entirely. Discipline during hardship is about maintaining presence, not pushing limits. Hard times also test identity. When progress slows or effort feels unrewarded, self-doubt increases, and the mind begins questioning whether discipline is worth maintaining. This is where identity must take over. You do not act to feel successful, you act to remain aligned with who you are. Identity-based discipline stabilizes behavior when emotions are unstable. You show up not because you feel strong, but because that is who you have decided to be. Patience becomes critical during difficult periods. Results may stall, progress may feel invisible, and effort may seem pointless. But discipline is not measured by immediate outcomes. It is measured by adherence to standards under pressure. When life is hard, discipline is about preventing regression rather than accelerating growth. Maintenance is success during adversity. Another essential principle is removing unnecessary self-judgment. Many people compound hardship by criticizing themselves for not performing at their best. This creates guilt, frustration, and burnout. Sustainable discipline requires self-respect without leniency. You acknowledge difficulty without using it as an excuse to disengage. You adjust expectations while maintaining execution. Discipline survives when compassion and structure coexist. Hard seasons eventually pass, but habits abandoned during them are difficult to rebuild. This is why discipline matters most when life is heavy. Anyone can show up when conditions are favorable, but discipline is forged when conditions are unfavorable. The strength you build during difficult periods carries forward and makes future challenges easier to manage. Discipline during hard times also strengthens resilience. Each time you execute despite resistance, you train your nervous system to tolerate stress without collapse. Over time, difficulty loses its power to derail behavior. What once felt overwhelming becomes manageable, not because life became easier, but because you became more stable. It is important to remember that discipline does not require you to ignore reality. It requires you to respond to reality intelligently. You adapt without surrendering structure. You simplify without quitting. You continue without breaking. This balance is what allows discipline to survive real life rather than ideal conditions. This chapter reinforces a critical truth. Discipline is proven during difficulty, not comfort. Easy days reveal nothing about discipline. Hard days reveal everything. When your systems are designed to endure stress, fatigue, and uncertainty, discipline becomes resilient rather than fragile. Life will get hard, but that does not mean discipline stops. It means discipline changes form. It becomes quieter, smaller, and more focused, but it remains present. When you stay disciplined through difficulty, you protect your identity, preserve momentum, and prevent regression. Discipline that survives hard times becomes unbreakable because it is no longer dependent on energy, mood, or circumstance. It is rooted in commitment, structure, and identity. This is the level of discipline that lasts. Chapter 9. Track discipline and apply pressure. Discipline does not maintain itself through intention alone. It is sustained through visibility, accountability, and pressure, because behavior that is not tracked eventually becomes inconsistent, and behavior that faces no consequence eventually becomes optional. Many people believe discipline fails because they lack strength or motivation, but in reality discipline fails because effort goes unmeasured and unreviewed. When discipline is invisible, urgency fades, and when urgency fades, execution weakens. Tracking discipline means making your behavior visible and undeniable. It removes guesswork and replaces assumptions with evidence. When you track your actions, you stop relying on how disciplined you think you are and start relying on what you actually did. This clarity is uncomfortable at first, but it is necessary because discipline cannot grow in self-deception. What you can see clearly, you can correct deliberately. The purpose of tracking is not self-judgment, it is self-control. Tracking allows you to identify patterns, weaknesses, and points of collapse before they become habits. Inconsistency rarely appears suddenly, it develops gradually through small skips that go unnoticed. Tracking exposes these skips early, giving you the opportunity to intervene before discipline deteriorates. Visibility is prevention. Tracking must be simple to be sustainable. Overcomplicated systems fail because they add friction to execution. A basic daily record of whether your non-negotiable rules were followed is often enough. Discipline strengthens when tracking is consistent, not when it is detailed. Simplicity increases compliance, and compliance is the goal. Review is the second layer of discipline enforcement. Tracking shows you what happened, but review explains why it happened. Without review, tracking becomes passive and ineffective. Review transforms information into strategy. It allows you to adjust systems, standards, and environments that are failing to support execution. Discipline improves when systems are refined, not when effort is endlessly increased. Review must be scheduled and unemotional. You do not review discipline in moments of frustration or pride. You review it at predetermined intervals, such as weekly or monthly. This prevents overreaction and creates stability. During review, the question is not whether you failed, but whether the system allowed failure to occur. Discipline strengthens when responsibility shifts from emotion to design. Applying pressure is the final and most critical component. Pressure is not punishment. Pressure is consequence. Behavior changes when there is something at stake. When skipping carries no cost, skipping becomes acceptable. When standards are enforced with consequence, compliance increases. Pressure creates urgency in the present moment, which counters the brain's tendency to prioritize comfort over commitment. Pressure must be immediate, proportional, and consistent. Delayed consequences lose impact, extreme consequences create resistance, and inconsistent consequences create confusion. Effective pressure reinforces standards without creating resentment. It teaches the brain that discipline matters. When pressure is applied consistently, the brain adapts by complying automatically rather than resisting repeatedly. Pressure also reinforces identity. When you hold yourself accountable, you confirm that your standards are real. Each time you enforce a consequence, you strengthen internal authority. When you ignore broken rules, you weaken self-respect and credibility. Discipline grows when your actions prove that your rules are not optional. Tracking, review, and pressure form a closed system. Tracking provides visibility, review provides correction, and pressure provides enforcement. Remove any one of these elements and discipline weakens. Together, they create a self-regulating structure that operates even when motivation is absent and life is demanding. This system removes reliance on emotion and replaces it with control. Another critical benefit of this system is that it externalizes accountability. Instead of arguing with yourself internally, the system reflects your behavior back to you objectively. This reduces mental conflict and preserves energy for execution. Discipline becomes less about internal struggle and more about responding to feedback. Pressure should evolve as discipline strengthens. In the early stages, stronger pressure may be necessary to overcome resistance. As discipline stabilizes and identity forms, pressure can be reduced because behavior becomes self-sustaining. The goal is not to live under constant pressure, but to use pressure strategically until discipline becomes automatic. Tracking should focus on behavior, not outcomes. Outcomes fluctuate and can discourage effort when progress is slow. Behavior is controllable and repeatable. Discipline grows when attention stays on execution rather than results. Results follow naturally when execution is consistent. Review should also simplify rather than complicate. If a rule is repeatedly broken, the solution is not more force, it is better design. Review identifies friction and removes it. Discipline strengthens when systems become easier to execute, not when effort becomes heavier. This chapter reinforces a vital truth. Discipline must be monitored, corrected, and enforced to survive. Intention fades, motivation fluctuates, but systems endure. When discipline is tracked, reviewed, and pressured appropriately, inconsistency has nowhere to hide. Tracking reveals the truth, review refines the approach, and pressure ensures compliance. Together, they transform discipline from a fragile intention into a durable system. When this system is in place, execution becomes predictable, identity stabilizes, and progress continues regardless of emotion. Chapter 10. Discipline is the foundation of all success. Discipline is not one trait among many. It is the foundation that supports every form of success, because without discipline, talent remains unused, knowledge remains theoretical, and potential remains unrealized. Intelligence without discipline produces ideas that never materialize. Motivation without discipline produces bursts of effort that never compound. Ambition without discipline produces frustration rather than results. Discipline is the mechanism that converts intention into execution and execution into outcome. Every meaningful achievement is governed by discipline. Financial stability is built through disciplined decisions repeated over time, not through isolated choices. Physical strength is built through disciplined training, not occasional effort. Mental clarity is built through disciplined focus, not sporadic reflection. Skill mastery is built through disciplined practice, not sudden inspiration. In every domain, discipline is the force that sustains effort long enough for progress to compound. Many people chase shortcuts, strategies, and external opportunities while ignoring discipline, believing success is hidden in information rather than behavior. This belief leads to constant searching and constant restarting. Discipline eliminates the need to restart, because progress continues even when conditions are imperfect. When discipline is present, systems work. When discipline is absent, even the best systems fail. Discipline creates reliability, and reliability builds trust. You trust yourself when you follow through consistently, and others trust you when your behavior is predictable. Opportunities flow toward people who are reliable, because reliability reduces risk. Discipline is not loud or dramatic. It is quiet and consistent, and its quiet nature is precisely what makes it powerful. Over time, disciplined behavior builds credibility that talent alone cannot create. Another reason discipline is foundational is that it stabilizes identity. When your actions are consistent, your self-image becomes clear. You no longer question whether you are capable or committed because your behavior confirms it daily. This clarity reduces internal conflict and increases momentum. Discipline removes chaos from decision-making by replacing emotional fluctuation with predictable execution. Discipline also simplifies life. Without discipline, life becomes reactive, scattered, and emotionally exhausting, because decisions are constantly being renegotiated. With discipline, many decisions are removed entirely. You know what you do, when you do it, and why you do it. This simplicity conserves mental energy and allows you to focus on execution rather than debate. Consistency, focus, resilience, and self-control all emerge from discipline. These qualities do not exist independently, they are outcomes of disciplined behavior. When discipline is weak, these qualities are unstable. When discipline is strong, they reinforce each other. Discipline becomes the central force that aligns effort across different areas of life. Discipline also protects progress during delay. Many goals take time to show results, and without discipline, most people abandon effort before results appear. Discipline allows you to continue executing without immediate reward. This patience is essential because success often arrives quietly after long periods of repetition. Discipline keeps you moving forward while others stop prematurely. Another critical function of discipline is that it reduces dependence on motivation entirely. When discipline is established, action becomes automatic. The brain adapts to repetition and conserves energy by automating behavior. This is why disciplined people often appear calm rather than driven. They are not fighting themselves daily, they are following patterns that no longer require emotional effort. Discipline is also the great equalizer. It allows ordinary individuals to outperform more talented individuals who lack follow-through. Over time, consistent disciplined effort surpasses sporadic brilliance. Discipline rewards endurance rather than excitement, patience rather than urgency, and structure rather than emotion. This is why discipline matters more than talent in the long run. All the principles in this audiobook exist to support one outcome: sustainable execution. Forced action builds discipline. Removing choice stabilizes behavior. Rules enforce standards. Environment reduces resistance. Identity locks behavior in place. Tracking and pressure sustain accountability. These elements work together to protect discipline, because discipline is the engine that drives all progress. It is important to understand that discipline is not about suffering or restriction, it is about control. It is the ability to direct your behavior toward long-term goals regardless of short-term impulses. This control creates freedom, because when you can trust yourself to execute, you are no longer controlled by emotion, distraction, or circumstance. Discipline does not guarantee instant success, but it guarantees progress. And progress, sustained long enough, becomes success. Without discipline, progress remains accidental. With discipline, progress becomes inevitable. This chapter brings the audiobook to its core truth. Discipline is not optional if you want lasting results. You do not need more information, more motivation, or more inspiration. You need disciplined execution applied consistently over time. When discipline becomes the foundation of your life, success stops being unpredictable and starts becoming a logical outcome of your behavior. Discipline is the quiet force behind every visible achievement. Build it deliberately, enforce it consistently, and protect it relentlessly. When discipline becomes your foundation, everything you build on top of it becomes stronger, more stable, and more sustainable. Force discipline now, earn freedom later. Discipline is not something you wait to feel ready for, and it is not something that appears when life becomes easier. Discipline is something you impose deliberately, consistently, and repeatedly until it becomes part of who you are. Throughout this audiobook, you have learned that motivation is unreliable, emotions are unstable, and willpower is limited, but structure, standards, identity, and enforced behavior create control that does not collapse under pressure. When discipline is forced long enough, resistance weakens, habits stabilize, and execution becomes normal rather than optional. The effort you apply now is not punishment, it is preparation. The pressure you enforce today is not restriction, it is protection. Every time you act without negotiation, you strengthen self-respect, build reliability, and reinforce an identity rooted in execution rather than emotion. Over time, discipline stops feeling heavy, not because effort disappears, but because discipline becomes automatic. The force fades, but the habit remains. Freedom is not found in doing whatever you feel like doing. Freedom is found in self-control, self-leadership, and the ability to act regardless of comfort, mood, or circumstance. When discipline becomes non-negotiable, progress becomes predictable, confidence stabilizes, and results stop being accidental. You no longer restart, replan, or renegotiate with yourself, you execute. This is the level where growth compounds quietly and consistently. If this audiobook has strengthened your discipline, sharpened your mindset, or helped you understand how discipline is truly built, make sure to subscribe to Audiobook Soundz, Chasing Greatness, where every audiobook is designed to push you beyond comfort and into control. Force discipline now, so you do not have to force your future later. When discipline becomes your foundation, freedom becomes inevitable.